My name is Raphael Mechoulam. I'm a professor at the Hebrew University. I've been there for many years. I'm doing research on the chemistry and biology of natural products, mostly, but also some drugs. There is no drug that doesn't have side effects. It just doesn't exist. The same is probably true for cannabis. Now, being a chemist, I was particularly interested in the individual constituents of the plant. Surprisingly, the constituents of the cannabis plant were not well known when we started work many years ago, several decades ago. The psychoactive component of cannabis was not known at that time, surprisingly again, because morphine had been isolated from opium almost 150 years before that, and cocaine about 100 years before that, and yet the active component of cannabis had never been isolated in pure form. So my colleague Oni and I went ahead doing that, and we published the compound, reported isolation of the active compound of cannabis, 1964, proved it, elucidated its structure, and a little bit later also synthesized it, so it became available for research. Now, scientists like to work with a specified compound, not just with a mixture, because otherwise it is very difficult to reproduce their results. And indeed, after 1964, there was a lot of work on THC and some of the other constituents, which we also isolated and elucidated their structures. And for the next 20 years, there was a lot of work on these compounds, and much of the things that we know about these compounds, the activity of these compounds, was done at that time. One thing was not known for 20 years, almost 20 years, and that was the mechanism of THC action. Surprisingly so. People thought that maybe it has some kind of an unspecified activity, acts on a membrane or something. Well, it turned out to be a mistake, actually. Alan Howlett, young professor at that time of pharmacology at St. Louis, found that there is a receptor, which was later called CB1, and then a person in England identified a second receptor known as CB2, mostly in the periphery, but then at some point it also pops up in the brain, especially neurological diseases. So now we are sure of two receptors that are present, and THC acts on them and stimulates them and causes the activity when needed. Now, receptors are not present in the body because there is a plant outside there. They are present in the body in order to be activated by something that our body produces when and where needed. So we went ahead looking for the compounds in the brain and the periphery that would activate these receptors, and in 1992 and 1995 we reported the most important ones. One of them we called anandamide. Ananda comes from the Sanskrit name of supreme joy, and we were happy after working so hard for identifying a compound which has turned out to have a different chemical structure from the compound in the plant. Rather strange, I would say, because the two compounds do exactly the same, and there was and these compounds which we identified in the brain and in the periphery, they're derivatives of fatty acid, and these compounds are very important because the receptors are found in large amounts, high concentrations in the brain and the periphery. These compounds are extremely important. They act in a huge number of physiological conditions. They interact with other neurotransmitters. They interact with in other systems as well. So they are important players in our body. So there has been a huge amount of work on these two compounds, anandamide, another one we isolated, 2-AG. And so today we know quite a lot about the mechanism and how they what they do, and therefore we can also learn a lot about the ability of plant cannabinoids like THC or synthetic cannabinoids that can act on this system, activate it or block it or change the metabolism of compounds that act on it. So it is quite promising, and chances are that we shall have drugs. We already have minor drugs, but I think that we shall have major drugs in the future that act through this particular system.